Hello, welcome to CodingBat. So, CodingBat is this website that I'm on right here. You can get to it by going to codingbat.com/Java. And basically what this website has is it has a bunch of practice programming problems in Java. It has a few in Python too, but we're obviously going to be doing Java. So, Um, if you haven't already, please create a CodingBat account. You can go over to the top right here and click Create Account and put in your username and password. And then once you have your account, you can sign in here. Let me just sign into mine real quick. Okay. Um, and now we are in the website. So basically, there are a bunch of different categories of problems, but really they're just Java practice problems. So we'll start with the warm-up and go through all of these. Not all in this video, but in a course of videos. So when we're doing this problems, or actually, let me step back for a second. The reason I'm making this whole sort of video series, I guess, is to help you learn Java just from the fundamentals, not assuming any prerequisite knowledge. So basically, I'm going to be going through these problems as if you know basically nothing about Java other than what I'm saying in these videos. So I'm assuming no prior knowledge. This is meant to be like accessible no matter what your skill level is. So if you don't know if you know basically nothing about Java, which is okay, um, go ahead and like watch through this video, do the problems with me. I'll tell you pause the video and try this problem on your own, and then I'll talk about or I'll write and talk about a solution. If you already do know quite a bit of Java, I would recommend going through these videos at like 2x speed and just listening along. You don't have to do the problems if they're too easy, but be honest with your skill level. Do the problems that you know are kind of difficult. So in this video, we're going to be doing the first problem of warm-up 1, and in other videos, we're going to be doing like whole sections at a time, but we're only going to be doing the first one problem today because again, I'm assuming you have no prerequisite knowledge, and therefore there's a lot of stuff I have to explain, to you in order for you to be able to do the problems. Um, and by the way, this part is being recorded after the fact, so that's why this already shows up as completed. But I will jump back to the original recording and go through the first problem now. So let's start with the first one. It's called sleepIn. And as I said, I'm going to be assuming no prior knowledge. Let me see if I can zoom in here. Okay, just a little bit. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to be assuming no prior knowledge, which means that I'm going to actually be talking a lot before I actually get to this problem because I need to explain everything that's going on here. So basically, you have this box here, and this box has some code in it. And this code is Java code, and you're going to be writing in some Java code here in order to solve the problem. Now you notice that it already has some code in here. This stuff I just highlighted is already code. And what you're going to be writing, the code you're going to be writing, is going to be in this area right here that my, cursor is going in between. So in other words, you're going to write code between these two curly brackets here. That's what these are called, by the way. Um, and so this thing here, the stuff that's already in this box, creates what is called a method. So a method in programming is very much like a function in math. So let me go over to the lovely MS Paint. Um, so, or sorry, Paint 3D, excuse me. Um, so let's say in math, you've used functions before in math, I'm sure. And maybe at some point they drew them like this. We have like f of x here. I know my handwriting with the mouse is not the greatest. And then you get some input here. Let's say like it's 7. And then it outputs some other number. Let's say it's 9, whatever. Okay, so you've dealt with, functions like this before. And maybe this function is defined as like f of x equals, let's just say x plus 2 would work for these inputs I've shown here. So that's all well and good. And basically what you're going to be writing is you're going to be writing one of these functions. So in other words, if you imagine this box as like a machine, what you're coding is going to be the inner workings of the machine that takes you from these inputs to these outputs. And I am saying inputs and outputs plurally because you can actually have multiple inputs for a function when you're doing programming. You can also have multiple inputs to functions in math, but you may not have used those very often in math class, multivariable functions. But don't worry, they're not complicated. They're exactly as you would think they are. Um, okay, so let's say now we have two inputs to this function. So maybe we have like, you know, well, I guess it will no longer be f of x now, but let's just call this function here f. Let me erase this. Here's our function f. And let's say as inputs we get like 5 and 3. So this function here has two inputs. And let's say it produces an output. Let's say it produces 8. So judging just on these two inputs, maybe we think that the function f takes its two inputs and adds them together, which would be, a reasonable thing to conclude. Okay. Now, in programming, we use numbers plenty, but we also use some other kinds of values other than numbers. And one of those kinds of values is something called a Boolean. So, a Boolean um, is something that is either true or false. So, let's say we have one input to this function or actually, let's just do a one input function for now. Sorry, my mouse is being a little annoying. Come on, mouse, please move. Okay. So let's say we have like one input to this function and it's true. And the output, so I'm going to use t for true, f for false, and the output is false. And by the way, functions don't have to go from one type to the same type. I could go from a Boolean to a number or a number to a Boolean. That would be fine too. But let's say I have this thing that goes from true to false. And let's say if I were to give it like another input, like for example, let me just make another box. So these are the same function here. I'm just showing two different inputs. Um, and I know that the colors are not the same. I'm sorry. Um, so then this one, let's say this input is false, and this output is true. Basically, what we can see that this function might be doing is it's just negating the variable here. So in other words, true goes to false and false goes to true. It's just flipping the truth of it. So that's what this function is doing. And of course, this function could have multiple inputs too. So let's do an example of that. I'm going to erase this here, and let's write a function like that. So, alright, so maybe this takes true and false as its inputs. And let's say this is true, this output is true if either one of the inputs are true. So if this input's true, or this input's true, or they're both true, then the output of this function will be true. Let's just say this is our imaginary function here. So that would be like one example of two inputs producing an output. And then we could do another example. Let's say it takes like false and false. So according to the rule I just said, neither of these are true, so the output would be false. Um, so you could imagine a bunch of different functions that take inputs and produce outputs. And maybe, like for example, let me just do one more function. Let's do one that goes from one type of value to a different type of value. So let's say I put in a 7 here, and I get the output true. So this function, it could be doing plenty of things, but let's say what this function is doing is it's taking in a number, an integer, let's say, and it's outputting true if that integer is a prime number and false if it is not a prime number. So let's give some other examples. So like if I put in 6 here, this would output false. If I put in 11, this would output true. So that is another example of a function you might have. So now, of course, in this box here, we would need to have basically some machinery, some programming, some code to actually determine whether or not an input is a prime number. And that's what you're writing. So you're writing the contents of one of these boxes here. So let's get back to CodingBat. So as I said, this thing here creates a function. So the name of the function is this thing right here. So, and I'll talk about what all of the things on the screen mean, all of these like words here in time, but this thing right here is the name of this function. And by the way, you might also hear functions called methods in Java. So notice that the name of the function can be multiple letters. In math, we usually have only one letter function names, like g of x, h of x, k of x. Uh, because in math, we also have variables that are one letter, and like if we had multi-letter function names, it might get confusing. Um, but in programming, that's not a concern. We can have functions whose names have multiple letters in them, which makes them a lot more readable, right? Because if something's called like is prime, it's very clear what that function does. Where if it's just called p of x, then that would not be very helpful. So in programming, we can have functions that have names of any length we want. Okay, and then inside these parentheses, there are going to be parentheses after the name of the function. These describe the inputs to this function. So, and these inputs are separated by commas. So the first input to our function is going to be a Boolean. That's what this Boolean means. And then the second input is also going to be a Boolean. And then these things here, after the type Boolean, and when I say type, I mean that's a type of value, a type of data we can have is a Boolean. Another type would be like a number. But after Boolean, we have this thing here, and this word here, this text here, is the name of that input. And the reason we care about that, this is just like if you're writing a function in math and I said f of x, well, x would be like the name of the input, right? Because we need to refer to x. Like if I want to say like f of x equals x squared, well, on the right-hand side of my function, when I'm saying x squared, I need to be able to refer to the input in order to square it, right? So I need to be able to refer to the inputs. So these things here are the names of my inputs. And just like the name of the function, they can have multiple characters in their name. So, so we see we have a function called sleepIn that takes two Boolean inputs. And another word for inputs in programming is parameters. And then yet another word is arguments. So sleepIn takes two parameters, both of type Boolean. Okay, and then this thing here, right before the name of the function, is what's called the return type of the function. And basically what this means is this is the kind of output the function is going to produce. So in our prime example earlier, the output of the function was a Boolean. But in our other example, and some of our other examples, the output was a number. So this thing right here, this right here before the name of the method, that describes what type of output this function is going to produce. So in this case, it is going to produce a Boolean output. So you have a function that takes two Booleans and produces another Boolean as the output. And then this thing public, don't worry about what public means just yet. Yeah, it is really not going to be relevant to anything we do on CodingBat. So you don't need to worry about public, that public is there. Just leave it there. Don't mess with it. And I'm sorry I say that. Usually I'd love to go and explain any new topic to you, but it's just not relevant to CodingBat. It will be relevant if you do some other coding in Java, but in CodingBat, all we're doing really is filling out methods. So, and like determining, the machinery for a certain function to work. So we're not really concerned about what public means. So do not concern yourself with that. So finally, we can get down to getting some of the machinery behind the scenes of this function. So inside of these curly brackets here, we are going to have we're going to put the machinery of our uh, our function here. And so in order to determine what this function does, we have to read the directions. So it's been like 14 minutes and we are finally getting to the directions. So it says the parameter, so now you know what parameter means because we just talked about it. The parameter weekday is true if it is a weekday. And remember, because it's a Boolean, it's either true or false. So the parameter weekday is true if it's a weekday, and the parameter vacation is true if we are on vacation. We sleep in if it is not a weekday or we're on vacation. Return true if we sleep in. Okay, so, and it gives us some examples of the function here. So like if the function was given the parameters false and false, which would mean we're not on a weekday and we're not on vacation, then we do sleep in because we're on a weekend, right? If we're not on a weekday, that means we're on a weekend and that we should sleep in. Okay, here's another example. If it is a weekday and we're not on vacation, then we should not sleep in. Seems pretty clear yet? I hope. Um, and if it is not a weekday, but we are on vacation, then we do sleep in. Okay, so that's all well and good. The only thing you might still not know in these instructions here is the word return. So basically, return, what returning means, returning is once you've inside the function, once you've done all the machinery, once you've figured out what your output is going to be, the way you actually send that output out to the outside world is using typing the word return. And what you'll do is you'll put the thing you want to send as the output of your function right after the word return. So like I could say return true, and that would mean that this function here outputs true. And what this thing I've just written here on this line here is what's called a statement, and at the end of every statement in Java you put a semicolon. So now basically inside of this method here, this function, I've written one statement that says return true. So in other words, this function right now is always going to produce the output true. Now, of course, this function is not going to satisfy the constraints of the problem, but I could still run it anyway by clicking go, and it'll show me some stuff on the side here. And let me explain what's going on the side. So basically, these things over here are called test cases. And what that means is that they are examples of inputs to your program and examples of expected outputs. And it tells you if your program uh, gave the right output. So so basically this column is the example of input that they're giving us. And then this column is what our program actually produced. So this line here is the first example that they give us in the problem. And this says if your sleepIn function was given false and false, two parameters, false and false, it should output true. And in the run column, it shows what we actually outputted, and we actually outputted true. So that's okay, because true, our output matched the expected output. So that's good, we get a green box. But in the second row here, you see that if the sleepIn function was passed the parameters true and false, it should return false. And so, but our program returned true. And so the expected result and the actual result are not the same. And so that test case failed. So we get a red box and an X. So our goal is to write code that passes all of these test cases. So that's what we need to write in our method here. So if you haven't already done so, please pause the video and try and solve this on your own. But if you don't know any Java knowledge yet, you will not know how to solve this on your own. So this problem I'm going to just basically work through and talk about how to solve it. And then on later problems, you'll be able to solve them on your own, hopefully. Okay, so let's solve this problem. So basically, we see that we sleep in if it is not a weekday or we're on vacation. So in order to test if a condition is true, you see the word if used in this problem statement quite a lot. So in order to test if a Boolean is true, there's a very simple way to do that. So the way you do that is you say if, you type the word if, and I'm going to delete this line here for now. What you do is you say if, and then you pass in. That's a phrase we use a lot in programming. Pass in just means to put the thing you want inside the parentheses, basically. So what we do is we say if, and then we put some parentheses, and inside these parentheses, we do the thing we want to test for whether or not it's true. So let's see. Let's do, like, for example, if we're on vacation, so this here is basically saying if the parameter vacation is true, then we can put some code in here. So what you do is after you've written if vacation with vacation inside the parentheses, you put a pair of curly brackets, and you usually will make some space between these curly brackets because we're going to want to put some more statements in here. So basically what we've written now is we've written what's called an if statement. This thing I just highlighted, this whole thing is called an if statement. And basically, the code inside of these curly brackets is only going to be run, is only going to be executed if this parameter vacation is true. So in other words, we pass in the parameter here to the if statement, and the code is executed if the parameter is true. So if we are on vacation, then we want to sleep in. And if we want to sleep in, then this function should return true. So what I'm going to say next is I'm going to say return true, because if we're on vacation, we want to return true. Okay, so that's good, but we haven't handled all the possibilities yet, right? Because what if we are not on vacation? Right now, if we're not on vacation, then this code will not be executed and our method won't do anything. And actually, if we try to click go here, we'll get something, we'll get what it calls compile problems. And that basically means that our code is not valid. It's not acceptable. Um, and the reason it's not acceptable is because if vacation is false, then our code's not going to do anything. Basically, there's this thing called a compiler that looks at your code before it runs your code. And basically, it says it can look at our code right now and it can say that, hey, your code doesn't handle all of the possible cases that your inputs could be. Therefore, it's not acceptable code because the function has to return something no matter what input you give it. So the compiler is basically saying that our code right now as it stands is not acceptable. And notice that the compiler saying your code is not acceptable and your code not fulfilling the tasks of the problem, those are two separate things, right? The code, where we just had return true, that code was acceptable to the compiler. It just didn't do the right thing. It didn't do what the problem asked us to do. So we need to have some other, cases in here in order to test some other code, some more code in here to handle the other possibilities that we could have here. So I'm going to tell you about something called an else statement. So if you just wrote an if statement here, so this thing I just highlighted, this whole thing is the if statement. If right after an if statement you type the word else, so we've got the if statement here, we're going to put the word else after. If you put, and then you just put some curly brackets here, then this code here, else, you can think of else as meaning kind of like otherwise. So if vacation is true, we're going to run this code. But otherwise, we're going to run the code between these curly brackets. So let's put some code in here. So if we're not on vacation, so we could just return false, but that wouldn't really work because if we're not on vacation, then we want to sleep in if it's a weekend and not sleep in if it is a weekday. So rephrasing that, if it is a weekday, we want to return false because we don't want to sleep in. And if it's not a weekday, we want to return true because we do want to sleep in. So inside of this else block here, this else statement, by the way, anytime you see two curly brackets, this is called a block. So when I say else block, I'm talking about this section right here. So inside this else block, I'm going to put another if statement. So I'm going to say if is a weekday, then we want to return false because we don't want to sleep in if it's a weekday. We have to get to school, right? So, but otherwise, if it is not a weekday, I put some extra curly brackets there. If it is not a weekday, we want to return true. And this should handle all of the cases. So I'm going to click go, and we see that it works. It is all correct. Okay, so we've now solved this problem. So let's look over this code once again. So if vacation is true, the parameter vacation is true, then we're going to return true because we do want to sleep in. Otherwise, we check the value of weekday and basically say, if weekday is true, we don't want to sleep in, but otherwise, we do want to sleep in. And that is how our code basically works. And the compiler can see that we have handled all possibilities of the input, and so we are good to go, and we solve the problem. Now, I'm not quite done with this problem, because I want to show you how you might be able to solve this better. And when I say better, I don't necessarily mean faster, like the code's going to run faster, because this code here is going to run basically instantly because, computers are very fast, and this is a pretty simple function. But I want to talk about how maybe you could write this code shorter, because there's no need to write all of this code if we could do this all in, say, one line, which, hint, we actually can. Sorry for the spoilers. Okay, so let's write this, perhaps shorter. Okay, so what we can do, we have this really cool feature that basically, when we say return, we don't just have to put true or false. Let's say we're returning a Boolean, right? Because this function returns a Boolean. We don't just have to say true or false. We can also put a variable here. So, and what the function will return is it will return the value of that variable. And by the way, when I say variable here, parameters, these things here, these are considered variables. So I could say variable or parameter if I was referring to weekday or vacation. You can create your own variables, which we'll get to later. Uh, but for now, these are the only variables we have, our weekday and vacation. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually say return and then put a variable after return. Um, and in fact, as we'll see later, you can actually put any expression after return. And an expression, by the way, is just something that has a value. So, of course, false has a value because false is false, right? And true has a value, true. But so does every variable. Every variable has a value. So if you say return and then we put a variable, the function will output the value of that variable. So let's see how we could use that now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, first I'm going to comment out this code here. And when I say comment out, the way I do that is I say slash star up here, and then I say star slash down here. And what that has done is that's basically uh, made it so that this code is ignored when this program is being executed. It's ignored by the compiler. It's only there for me. It's like, in Google Docs when you put like a comment, right? The comment is not is not in the document. It's just, something you can see if you were reading the document. Um, so that's like this comment here. It's not actually part of our code anymore. This code here is not actually part of our code anymore because I've commented it out. I've put these things around it. Um, so if I run it, right, it won't work because this code will be ignored and I won't be handling all the cases because I don't have any return statement here. Uh, but now this code has been commented out, so it's ignored when my program is being run. I'd get a compiler error now, as you can see, because I don't have a return statement. Because, in other words, I'm not producing an output if I go into this else block. And of course, I need to produce an output for any function. Okay, so let's see how we might be able to write this a little shorter. So if weekday is true, we want to return false. Well, let's think about this. I could say return weekday here, and let's think about what this would do. This would mean that if weekday is true, we return true, and if weekday is false, we return false, right? Because if you say return and then a variable, it just returns the value of that variable. So we could do this, but this actually won't work. I can run it. It does satisfy all the compiler's uh, conditions, so it will work. However, it does not produce the correct output. So, and that's because basically what we want to do is we want to return the opposite of weekday, right? If weekday is true, we want to return false. If weekday is false, we want to return true. But right now, we're just returning the same thing as weekday. So the way in Java you denote the opposite of a Boolean variable is you just put an exclamation mark before it. And you can also do this with just any, Boolean thing. So like I could also say, return uh, not false. And not false, of course, means true. By the way, this exclamation mark might be read as not, because it's sort of the negation um, of the thing that comes right after it. So if I say return not weekday, or in other words, return the opposite of weekday, if I click go now, this will work. So this is a much shorter way of writing our program. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this code that I commented out. The reason you might do this if you are programming, the reason you might comment out code like this is, let's say, I'm going to go ahead and experiment on ways I can make this shorter, but let's say I don't find a successful way to make it shorter. I might just revert back to my old code that I had here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this commented out code now because I don't need it. I'm just going to say return the opposite of weekday. Okay, so we've made our code a lot shorter, but we can actually make it even shorter. So let's think about how we could do that. So basically, let's think about what our function is doing. So if you look at the outputs here, I think this makes it makes it very easy to see. So we're returning true if, well, first of all, if vacation is true, we're returning true, right? No matter what. So we always return true if vacation is true. But we also return true if weekday is false. So in other words, if vacation is true or weekday is false, we should return true. But if weekday is true and vacation is false, then we return false. If you need to pause the video and think about all these words I'm saying, trues and falses, then go ahead and rewind and do that. So basically, if we're looking at the outputs here, we see that we return true when vacation is true, and we also return true when weekday is false. So if either, in other words, if either vacation is true or weekday is false, or both, then we go ahead and return true. Otherwise, we return false. So let's think about how we could do that. I'm going to rewrite this code, uh, not in any way that's shorter yet, but I'm going to rewrite it in a way that uses that idea I just talked about. So I'm going to once again comment out this section here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and try and write this code. So basically, inside the if statement, the if statement here, I'm going to go ahead and set up the structure here because I'm going to do an if-else kind of thing. But I'll of course need to fill in the code inside of these curly brackets and inside these parentheses. So the if statement is a lot more powerful than what I've shown you so far, because not only can it just test a single variable if it's true, but actually you can pass in any Boolean expression inside of these parentheses. And the if statement, if that expression is true, will evaluate this code. Otherwise, if you have an else part, it'll evaluate the code in the else part. Okay, so, and again, when I say Boolean expression, that is some, some text, some code that has a Boolean value. And as you see much more examples of Boolean expressions, that'll hopefully become, clearer to see. And of course, the simplest kind of expression is something like true or false. And then we could also have like a variable like weekday or vacation. These would all be valid Boolean expressions because they have a Boolean value. Um, but of course, there are more complicated kinds of expressions, just like 1 plus 2 times 7 in math, right? That's an expression because it has a numeric value. And so we need to put a Boolean expression in here. So what we were just talking about is that if vacation is true, or, and this or is not valid code yet, I'm just typing out the words here, and then we'll turn this into proper code in just a second. So if vacation is true, or weekday is false, again, this is not valid code right now. So if vacation is true, I'll say is true, or weekday is false, then my function should return true because we should sleep in. Otherwise, it should return false. Okay, so this is the basic structure we've got here. I just need to turn this part inside of my if statement into valid, acceptable code. So in order to test if vacation is true, I actually don't need to even put anything else. I just need to put if vacation, right? Because that tested if vacation is true. Because if vacation is true, then the Boolean expression vacation will have the value true. Otherwise, it will have the value false. So I just need to put vacation. If I want to ask if vacation is true, I just need to put the name of the variable, vacation. Because its value is true if it's true, and its value is false if it's false. Okay, and then the way I say weekday is false, I could say weekday equals false. And so equals, this is basically lets you compare to Boolean expressions here. And sorry, let me check one thing real quick. Okay, I am back now. Okay, so basically, if vacation is true, And I could, of course, also say vacation equals true to compare the value of vacation to the value true. And so in other words, if vacation is true or weekday is false, this would be an acceptable way to do it. But I don't need the equals true because, again, this thing here that I've highlighted is a Boolean expression that evaluates to true if vacation is true and false if vacation is false. But this thing here is also a Boolean expression, which evaluates to true if vacation is true and false if vacation is false. So putting equals true here is kind of redundant. I don't need to. I'll leave it in for now because it makes it very clear what we're doing, but you don't need to. And then finally, the way we write or in Java is by doing two bars here. And I don't know what these things are called. Some people call them the pipe character. Um, but if you hold shift and press the backslash key, that will type one of these guys here. But if you put two of those, then it means or. Okay, so now let's run this and click go, and you see that it works. Okay, so I can delete this commented out section now. Okay, so I didn't really make the code any shorter, but I put it all into one if statement, and I said either return true or return false. Now, notice something very interesting here. We just talked about how I can say return, and then I can put any Boolean expression after it. So what I can do, I'm going to comment out this code now, is, well, what we have right here is we have a Boolean expression, right? And this expression, whenever this expression is true, we want to return true. Whenever this expression is false, we want to return false. So, guess what we can do? We can just return that expression. And there we go. If I run this, it will work and it will all be correct. So in other words, we're returning the value of this Boolean expression. And the value of this expression is exactly, going to be true true when we want it to, false when we don't want it, or false when we want it to be false. Okay. Finally, if we want to make this even shorter, we can delete the equals true because, as I said, it's redundant. Because vacation has the value true when it's true and false if it's false. And then over here, we can shorten this a little bit. So basically what we want this expression to be is we want it to be the opposite of weekday, if you kind of think about that, right? Because if weekday is true, then weekday equals false is false, because true does not equal false. If you need to slow it down and re-listen to that, go ahead. But if weekday is false, then this expression, this thing that I'm about to highlight, this here, has the value true because false equals false. So in other words, weekday equals false has the same value as the opposite of weekday. And we just talked about how to find the opposite of weekday is by doing exclamation mark weekday. And if I run this, now this will work. So that was like 40 minutes on the easiest CodingBat problem there is. But I assumed you had no starting Java knowledge. So that is the first CodingBat problem. And I think I'm going to do the rest of the 30 problems in another video. The rest of them, of course, will not take 40 minutes each because I wanted to explain a bunch of, prior things to you. But that is the first CodingBat problem. And this code right here, this is how, an actual Java, a seasoned Java programmer would actually write this method. So, yeah, in the next video, I will finish this section here, warm up 1.